Welcome back to another video. Because the 31st March synopsis was not available today, I've gone back to 1st March 2021 because I've not made videos before 28th of March. So going on, wherever I get time, I will cover other synopsis documents also, other synopsis material also. So the first question of today is the General Studies 1. The socio-religious reformers of the 19th to 20th century aimed at modernization rather than westernization. Do you agree? Discuss. So this is as part of General Studies 1, and the topic is modern Indian history from about the middle of the 18th century until the present. Significance, events, personalities, and issues. Okay, and this is part of 1st March 2021 secure synopsis. Now let us move ahead and answer the question. Introduction can be put out this way. Socio-religious reform movements are linked with different ideas, including presence of colonial government, economic and social backwardness of society, influence of modern Western ideas, rise of intellectual awakening in the middle class, and poor position of women in society. From the earlier 20th, 19th century, debates and discussion about social customs and practices took a new character due to the development of new forms of communication. Various reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy practices took a new character due to the development of new forms of communication. Various reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Swami Dayanand Saraswati persuaded people to give up degraded age-old traditions like sati, child marriage, polygamy, female infanticide, etc. by adopting a new way of life. They were keen to spread knowledge of modernization in the country and bring about greater freedom and equality for women and lower caste people. Westernization is a process of imitation of culture and values of Western countries by non Western countries, whereas modernization has a wider connotation. Adopting the modern style or modern ways and ideas of thinking, living, etc., is modernization. Modernization is a change or modification which covers or offers the promise of the preservation of the past. 19th to 20th century socio-religious reforms aimed at modernization rather than westernization? Yes. Reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Jyotiba Phule, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Pandita Ramabai understood that ignorance and backwardness in the society was responsible for hindering its progress and development. They studied the religious scriptures and criticized the prevalent religious and social practices. According to them, society should be based on the concepts of liberty and equality both for men and women, and this was possible only by the spread of modern and scientific education, especially among the women. These movements came to be called socio-religious movement because the reformers felt that no change is possible in a society without reforming the religion. The socio-religious reform movement as a whole was against backward element of traditional culture in terms of both religious and social evils. The focus was on regeneration of traditional institutions including medicine, education and philosophy and so on. There were differences in methods of those reform movements, but all of them were concerned with the regeneration of society through social and educational reforms. The aim of these reforms was never to replace the local culture of India with Western culture. Rather, they simply assimilated some Western values which they saw as desirable for the development of the society, such as humanism. They emphasized more on the interpretation of scriptures and simplification of rituals rather than outrightly imitating Westernization. Swami Vivekananda sought to bring reform through reinterpretation of the Vedas in the context of the changing world. He stressed on the ideal of social service and selfless action. Raja Ram Mohan Roy too had great respect for Western way of thinking, yet gave utmost respect and importance to Vedas and Upanishads. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar used the ancient text to suggest that could remarry widows could remarry. His suggestions were adopted by British officials and law was passed in 1856 permitting widow remarriage. Such thinkers were against certain social evils like sati, idolatry, polytheism, untouchability, etc., but they believed in the essence of scriptures as a persuasive truth and not that was not compatible with the modern notions of equality and dignity of all individuals. In India, social reform did not ordinarily mean a reorganization of the structuring of society at large as it did in the West for the benefit of underprivileged social and economic classes. Instead, it meant the infusion into the existing social structure of the new ways of life and thought, and the society would be preserved while its members would be transformed. Now let's conclude this answer. The socio-religious reform movements of the 19th to 20th century have made very significant contribution in the evolution of today's modern India. They stood for the democratization of society, removal of superstition and abhorrent customs, spread of enlightenment, and development of a rational and modern outlook. By the end of 20th century, women themselves were actively working for reform. They wrote books, edited magazines, founded schools and training centers, and set up a women's association. These women later on joined various kinds of nationalist and socialist movements and contributed immensely in the freedom struggle. Let's move on to the next question as part of General Studies 2. The topic is Prime Minister. The government is the master of the country and Prime Minister is the master of government. In this context, discuss the functions and powers of the Prime Minister as the head of the government. The Prime Minister of India is the leader of the executive of the Government of India. The Prime Minister is also the chief advisor to the President of India and head of the Council of Ministers. They can be a member of any of the two houses of the Parliament, the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. The Prime Minister selects and can dismiss members of the Cabinet, allocates posts to members within the government, and is presiding member and chairperson of the Cabinet. The Union Cabinet, headed by Prime Minister, is appointed by the President of India to assist the latter in the administration of the affairs of executive. The Union Cabinet is collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha as per Article 75, Clause 3 of the Constitution of India. What are the functions of Prime Minister? Formation of the Council of Ministers. Article 75 provides that Prime Minister is appointed by the President and other ministers shall be appointed by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. While appointing Council of Ministers, he keeps in his mind that he must include people of different caste and religion. He must give representation to all states, union territories and regions. Removal of ministers. No minister can stay in the Council of Ministers against the wishes of the Prime Minister. The PM can demand the resignation of such a minister. If a particular minister does not resign, then PM can ask the President to dismiss him or he can submit his own resignation. The ministers can be removed by the President on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. He is also the leader of cabinet. Yes, the PM is the chairman or a leader of the cabinet. He convenes the meetings, prepares the agenda for the meetings, and controls and guides the discussion in the meetings. The PM is the maker, leader, chairman, and destroyer of the cabinet. Allocation of portfolios. It is an undisputed privilege of the Prime Minister to allocate portfolios to his minister. Which particular department is to be given to which minister is determined by him. Any minister objecting to such an allotment invites the wrath of the Prime Minister and can get completely ignored from the ministry. Coordination among different departments. The PM acts as the general manager and the chief coordinator. It is his responsibility to coordinate the activities of all departments and to secure cooperation amongst all the departments. For these purposes, he called the meetings of different departments and coordinate their work. The link between the President and the Council of Ministers. The PM is the main link between the President and the Council of Ministers. No minister has direct access to the President except with the permission of the PM. He is also the leader of Parliament. The PM is not only the leader of the party but also the leader of Lok Sabha and leader of the Parliament. He announces the major policies of the nation on the floor of the Parliament. He decides the complete agenda of the House in consultation with the Speaker of Lok Sabha. He is the Director of Foreign Affairs. The PM acts as the chief architect of India's foreign relations. He is responsible for India's prestige and participation in international relations. The PM is chief promoter of India's national interest and plays an important role in international conferences and negotiations. Role in economic planning. He plays a leading role in all fiscal and developmental planning. All important decisions related to financial matters are made by him. He plays a very significant role in the process of socio-economic modernization. Power of appointment. Formally, the appointments to high posts are made by President, yet in reality, the lists are prepared by the Prime Minister. The approval of the President is just a formality. These appointments include the governors, the Attorney General, the Auditor, the Ambassadors, the Consular. All the high-ranking appointments and promotions are made by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. As a chief administrator, the PM is the real chief executive of the nation, and as he is the head of the administration who has full power to implement the programs and fulfill the promises of the party. Role as the leader of the nation. PM is the leader of the nation. He is the channel through which all other nations deal with India. He alone can speak for the Indian Republic. Role of Prime Minister during an emergency. The emergency powers of the President are in reality the powers of Prime Minister. The President declares an emergency only under the advice of the Cabinet, in which in reality means the advice of the Prime Minister. All decisions taken to meet an emergency are really the decisions of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister can get the imposition of President's rule in a state. The presidential decision is in favor of imposing an emergency in a state is always governed by the decision of the Prime Minister and his Cabinet. Let's have a look at the powers of the Prime Minister. PM in the Indian context is endowed with immense powers, which makes him a very powerful constitutional ruler in the world. PM is the general coordinator of their activities. PM presides over the cabinet meetings, conferences with individuals, Ministers encourage and instructs them. PM can ask any minister to resign. In the Indian system of parliamentary democracy, the PM is the actual ruler or the chief executive. PM enjoys vast administrative, legislative, and emergency powers. PM provides leadership in policy formulation and plan implantation and provides the vital link between the government and the people, between the government and the president. PM is the most powerful citizen of our country. The Prime Minister plays an important role in policy making, planning, legislation, decision making, etc. The office of the Prime Minister is the most powerful office in India. If Cabinet is the strongest institution, the Prime Minister is the strongest person in the Cabinet under the Constitution of India. The real center of power is the office of Prime Minister. He is the head of the government of India. He is the real custodian of all executive authority. Now let's move on to the next topic, which is called as the Cabinet Committees. Now, under the Cabinet Committees, we have a question today. Discuss the purpose of a Cabinet Committee while explaining the types and their composition. Why are Cabinet Committees important in dealing with the big issues of the day and the government's overall strategy? This is part of the Lakshmikant syllabus. Now let's go ahead and read it out. The Cabinet Committee are organizations which are instrumental in reducing the workload of the Cabinet. These committees are extra constitutional in nature and are nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. However, the rules of business provide for their establishment. The executive in India works under the Government of India Transaction of Business Rules 1961. Recently, the Government of India has released the composition of 8 cabinet committees, including 2 new ones, one on investment and the other on employment and skill development. Let's have a look at the types and composition of cabinet committees. Now, there are standing cabinet committees, ad hoc cabinet committees, and let's have a look at each one of them. Standing cabinet committees are permanent in nature with a specific job. The cabinet ministers are called its members, while the people without the rank of cabinet committee are called its special invitees. Standing committees include the following: that is, appointments committee of the cabinet cabinet committee on accommodation, cabinet committee on economic affairs, cabinet committee on parliamentary affairs, cabinet committee on political affairs, on security, on investment and growth, on employment and skill development. Ad hoc cabinet committees are temporary in nature and are formed time to time to deal with specific tasks. Now let's have a look at the composition. The composition of a cabinet committee varies from 3 to 8 people. Even ministers who are not part of the cabinet can be added to a cabinet committee. Usually, each cabinet committee has at least one cabinet minister. The members of the cabinet committee can be from both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. Importance of cabinet committees. Article 77th, clause 3 of the Constitution states, the President shall make rules for the more convenient transaction of business of the Government of India and for the allocation among ministers of the said business. The Prime Minister constitutes standing committees of the Cabinet and sets out the specific functions assigned to them. He can add or reduce the number of committees. They solve issues and formulate proposals for the consideration of the Cabinet and take decision on matters assigned to them. However, the Cabinet is empowered to review such decisions. This device enables ministers to bargain and compromise with each other, and this reduces pressure of work upon the cabinet. Consequently, the cabinet is left free to devote itself to more important matters. The committee system safeguards the principle of collective responsibility, which is an essential feature of the cabinet system. These committees facilitate deep examination of the policy issue and effective coordination. Many a times when an activity or agenda of the government acquires prominence or requires special thrust, a cabinet committee may be set up for focused attention. In all areas delegated to the cabinet committees, normally the decision of the cabinet committee in question is the decision of the government of the day. Ministers of state and deputy ministers who are not members of the cabinet are members of one or more committees. This is the way in which they can or brought into closer association with the work of the cabinet. Thus, all ministers continue to be partly responsible for the government's action. Cabinet committee increases the effectiveness of the political control over public services. The public servants are called upon by the committees to justify their proposals and comment on problems under review. This procedure establishes a close interface between a politician and public servants and ensures that those who formulate policy are reasonably well informed. It also eliminates the possibility of any one department carrying a disproportionate weight of opinion. The committees also act as collective check on individual ministers and on the Prime Minister. In view of the growth in the volume and complexity of the government business, a proper division of labor and effective delegation within cabinet requires committees to perform functions devolved on them by the cabinet. They focus supra-ministry attention on particular sectors of administration. Effective coordination is their main contribution. Conclusion: the cabinet committees wield a real power of decisions on less important general policy matters. Other matters which must be dealt with in the cabinet are also withheld in committees. Only the delicate and complex points or those on which ministers differ remain for discussion by the cabinet. What has saved the cabinet as the central decision-making body is the elaborate network of cabinet committees which have acted as a clearing house. Let us move on to the next question under the topic of important international institutions, agencies, and fora, their structure and mandate. Account for the role of International Atomic Energy Agency in enhancing nuclear accountability of the world, also bring out the associated concerns. So this article was part of the Hindu, and let us have a look at it. The International Atomic Energy Agency is an international organization that seeks to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy and to inhibit its use for any military purpose, including nuclear weapons. Iran and International Atomic Energy Agency have agreed to temporarily measure its to offset Iran's decision to restrict access to inspectors. In December 2020, Iran's parliament passed the law demanding a suspension of some inspections of if the USA failed to lift sanctions. Let's look at the body of it. Widely known as the world's Atoms for Peace and Development Organization with the United Nations family, the IAEA is the International Center for Cooperation in the Nuclear Field. The agency works with its member states and multiple partners worldwide to promote safe, secure, and peaceful use of nuclear technologies. The IAEA has its headquarters in Vienna, Austria. It was established as an autonomous organization on 29 July 1957 through established independently Though established independently of the UN through its own international treaty, the IAEA reports to both the UN General Assembly and UN Security Council. Functions of the IAEA: promoting and assisting the research, development, and practical applications of peaceful uses of nuclear technologies, establishing and administering safety guards to ensure that such research and development, etc., by the IAEA is not used for military purposes, applying under the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and other international treaties, mandatory comprehensive safeguards in non-nuclear weapon states parties to such treaties. Role of IAEA is in enhancing nuclear accountability of the world. The IAEA's framework for nuclear security includes international legal instruments that are both binding and non-binding, which it encourages states to sign and adopt. Binding documents include the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and its amendment, the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements and additional protocols. The non-binding international instruments include the IAEA Code of Conduct on Safety and Security of Radioactive Sources and the IAEA Supplementary Guidance on the import and export of radioactive. In addition, the IAEA has circulated a document entitled The Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and Nuclear Facilities, containing recommendations for states to implement voluntarily. Moreover, the IAEA is entrusted with the responsibilities under a number of other treaties and agreements that states have adopted related to nuclear materials, including providing the safeguarding system established under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 1970. Through its nuclear security program, the IAEA provides training, human resource development assistance, and technical advice to states and facilitates the exchange of information and lessons learned. This includes assisting states in establishing an effective regulatory infrastructure, improving physical protection at facilities with clear and other radioactive materials, strengthening capabilities at borders to detect and respond to illicit nuclear trafficking, and establishing preparedness to respond to acts of nuclear or radiological terrorism. The IAEA also offers a number of advisory services to aid states in assessing the effectiveness of their nuclear security arrangements and identifying any necessary enhancements. After the September 11 terrorist attacks, the agency conducted a thorough review of its activities and programs relevant to preventing acts of terrorism involving nuclear and radioactive materials and developed the Nuclear Security Plan for 2002 to 2005. This was followed by subsequent plans for 2006, 2009, and 2010 2013. The IAEA supports states in improving their capacities to prevent, detect, and respond to the illegal use or transfer of nuclear and other radiological materials, as well as the protection of nuclear installations. Another tool to address the illicit use of WMDs is the agency's illicit trafficking database, created in 1997 in order to track unauthorized activities and events involving nuclear and other radioactive material outside of regulatory paradigm. The IAEA leads the counter-terrorism implementation task force's working group on preventing and responding to a WMD terrorist attack. In this capacity, the IAEA has worked to strengthen and integrate interagency response to a terrorist attack using chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons or material. Challenges faced: the IAEA has no authority to act on its own, but relies on the willingness of nations to cooperate or on a UN mandate. Its former head, Mohammad Ibaradi, complained that the agency enjoyed only uneven authority. The problem became apparent in 2002 when North Korea expelled IAEA inspectors, making it almost impossible for the agency to monitor Pyongyang's nuclear activities. Israel, which analysts believe has nuclear warheads, has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and is not subject to IAEA inspections or sanctions. India and Pakistan, which have acknowledged their possession of nuclear weapons, are also not signatories to the treaty. The IAEA has been accused, notably by Pakistan, of restricting the transfer of nuclear know-how to developing countries, hindering their social and economic development. On the legal or political front, the challenge for the IAEA verification regime is relatively simple to understand. Strengthened safeguards can only be fully implemented in the states that have enforced both a comprehensive safeguards and agreement and an additional protocol. In other words, the system is only effective to the degree that states follow through on their political commitments. The agency can only provide the required credible assurances if it is given the necessary authority. Although the model additional protocol has been in place for 6 years, to date, the results are disappointing. Out of 189 states party to the NPT, additional protocols have been approved by the Board of Governors for 81 states and are enforced for only 37 states. The need for the additional protocol to become universal in application thus remains of paramount importance. From a technological perspective, verification challenges are constantly evolving. To illustrate, consider that in Iraq's clandestine development of a uranium enrichment program, it explored 6 different techniques: electromagnetic isotope separation, gaseous centrifuge, gaseous diffusion, molecular and atomic vapor laser isotope separation, ion exchange, and chemical processes. In addition, the commercial knowledge and technologies necessary to conduct a covert nuclear weapons program have become more accessible, and the means to implement procurement, deception, and concealment strategies have become increasingly sophisticated. To respond adequately to our growing responsibilities, the agency must naturally be provided with the necessary financial and human resources. The verification program has been chronically underfunded, resulting in excessive reliance on extra budgetary resources, with all the negative consequences that come with such reliance in terms of independence, planning, and staffing. Conclusion: progress is therefore needed in all the areas. The agency must be given adequate financial resources, must be provided the requisite legal authority by all states, and must ensure its technological sophistication to enable it to provide the international community with credible and impartial conclusions related to the application of safeguards. Facing these challenges and achieving further progress in both nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament will require considerable cooperation and support of all those involved. At all levels in both the scientific and political spheres, agency staff, national policymakers, and facility operators are required. Let's move on to the next topic under General Studies 3: awareness in the fields of IT, space, computers, robotics, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and issues relating to intellectual property rights. In the backdrop of commercialization of space sector, explain the limitations that are being faced by private sector in space exploration in India. This article explains how we should use private participation and nudge India towards a scientific pursuit of space exploration driven by economic aims. This is how the introduction starts. India has been achieving great feats in the space arena, ranging from Mangalyaan to launching 104 satellites at one go to the recent Chandrayaan 2 mission. However, it is ironic that India, whose spacefaring tradition is decidedly in the service of human development, is lagging in harnessing the power of private innovation in the space domain. This is not only limits the exploitation of space for economic development but has serious national security implications. Background of this: ISRO on Sunday successfully launched Brazil's optical Earth observation satellite Amazonia 1 and 18 co-passenger satellites from India and the USA and from Satish Dhawan Space Center at Sriharikota. So, blazing a trail, ISRO's first launch of 2021 in numbers, 19 satellites, including Brazil's Earth observation satellite, which is called as Amazonia 1, were carried by the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle PSLV C-51. 13 satellites were from the US. 5 satellites, including the Satish Dhawan satellite from the Chennai-based Space Kids India, were built by students. 78th mission from Sriharikota. 53rd flight of India's Workhorse launch vehicle PSLV. It was the first dedicated launch by the New Space India Limited, a PSU set up under the Department of Space in 2019. ISRO has till date launched 342 foreign satellites from 34 countries. Amazonia 1, with a mission life of 4 years, will monitor deforestation in the Amazonia region. The STSAT has an engraving of Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the top panel to show solidarity and gratitude for North Atmanirbhar initiative and space privatization. So let's move on to the next. That is India's space program potential advantages of rising space industry, adding an edge to India's foreign policy as our space capabilities can be a part of our initiatives to foster new relationships, avoiding the outflow of taxpayers' money to foreign hands from where we can procure turnkey products and services, creating more opportunities for foreign direct investments as well as new jobs for highly skilled labor market, empowering India's defense system by equipping it with space technology and allowing armed forces to procure defense products and services indigenously, and reversing the brain drain from India. Challenges for private space entities in India. Monopoly in India, space means Indian Space Research Organization. Globally, the technology is highly protected because of its dual use capability. Even if it was not, it would be prohibitively expensive. Funding: a major challenge in setting up a space business in India is funding. Space industry is capital intensive, and upstream activities come with a long gestation period. Investors' dilemma: the lack of clarity among the investors and lack of ecosystem required for significant contribution is a challenge for the investors. Lack of regulation: India is a party to the Outer Space Treaty, where one of the fundamental requirements laid upon states is the supervision of space activities within its borders. The country did not have any formally legislated laws. This is a potential roadblock for commercialization. Growth challenges: scaling up international marketing and funding are challenges. Lack of support: the Indian ecosystem has neither incubation support nor pointers to seek support of leaders such as ISRO for the space startups. Political and bureaucratic hurdles: limit private space operations in India. Low in-house capacity of ISRO restricts them to a very few launches in a year. Privatization can offload 30 to 40% of the work and help them work more efficiently. Way forward: India should have national space activities legislation which takes on board all stakeholders. A public-private partnership model can be looked upon to realize ISRO's workhorse polar satellite launch vehicle with a joint venture between ISRO and private sector. In the UK, space ventures are treated as a complement to big organizations and not a competitor. This should be encouraged in India too. A supportive international partner and like-minded local partners helps to set up a space business. The idea should be to let the private industry build their own facilities after gaining enough expertise. ISRO has built a space technology park spread over 25 acres in Bengaluru, where the entire range of facilities have been set up for use by the industry. Conclusion: the private sector already supplies majority of the subsystems in satellite manufacturing. This can be further scaled up into other activities with proper regulation and partnership of the ISRO and private sector. The country must deregulate the space sector to encourage private enterprise if we are to compete in this new space economy. General studies: 4. While individual beliefs and values determine one's subjective responsibility, it is the operational environment that guides, shapes the objective responsibility. Congruence between the two is inevitable for realizing the goal of objectivity in administrative decisions. Uh, why this question? The question is based on the theme of importance of objectivity in decision making. An objective decision is one which is not influenced by one's personal feelings, perspectives, interests, and biases. Objectivity in governance means adherence to rationality, legality, and to prove standards, procedures, and norms in institutions by the public authorities. It implies that the governance decisions must be taken based on merit and after rigorous analysis of evidence. Body: one's values and beliefs are shaped by many factors such as religion, family, school, and friends, and there may be certain bias or prejudice that may be deep seated. For these reasons, every organization and institutions have rules, regulations, and code of conduct to bring in maximum objectivity in the decision making process. For instance, the ICICI Bank mismanagement by Chanda Kochar by forwarding loans indirectly to a company where her husband had stakes was gross mismanagement of power. Here, her objectivity was clouded by favorable loans despite no merit to own kith and kin. It is for these reasons there needs to be less discretionary powers and a proper set of rules on laws and conduct protocols to ensure that extraneous factors do not influence the decision making. Regardless of perspective, an objective decision must rely solely on facts, evidence, and analysis that is in principle verifiable by selfless and disinterested people with diverse points of view, interests, and backgrounds. The objectivity in administrative decision making helps in taking right decisions in case of ethical moral dilemmas. It helps to maintain impartiality and fairness, prevents injustice in governance, enhance professionalism, increase resource utilization efficiency, improve public service delivery, enhance transparency in the public domain. It also helps to overcome biases, favoritism, and helps in management of conflict of interest. Yet sometimes it is not always possible to bring in absolute objectivity in extraordinary situations that are unaccounted for, such as the pandemic. One needs to take decisions in the interest of greater good. That is, example, strict lockdown protocol was initiated. Migrants and laborers were left stranded, and eventually states realized the folly and paved way by arranging the transport to them. Conclusion: although objectivity is a must in governance for maintaining accountability, transparency, neutrality, and probity in governance, careful deliberation and analysis of situations in public interest and an enlightened objectivity rather than absolute objectivity is more appropriate to add fairness and caters to the needs of the changing social paradigms. The regulation and procedure of human clinical trials vary from nation to nation. Stem cell research, as an emerging biomedical field, requires approval for human trials and encounters multiple challenges. You are the head of a team of scientists who developed a new tissue engineering system which appears to be a promising means of regenerating heart tissue. Trials of the system have already been conducted on animals and yielded good results. Millions of people suffering from critical diseases would benefit immensely if this medication is immediately made available to them. However, you need to conduct human clinical trials before it could be commercialized. It is also known that stringent regulatory environment in the country will mean that human trials and final approval will take many years before it is made commercially available. On the other hand, regulation of clinical trials in many poor countries is weak and quick approval is possible. Many of your competitors also resort to human trials in these countries, often bribing the officials for getting quick approvals. Given the situation, answer the following questions. Identify the ethical issues which arise during clinical trials. Given the above situation, would you prefer to shift human trials to a third country where regulations are lax? Explain and give reasons to in support of your choice. This question is part of Ethics, Integrity, and Aptitude by Lexicon. Now, let's get ahead and answer this question. New and emerging areas of scientific research, especially concerning treatment of ailments, require stringent regulation as it has ethical conundrums attached, as well as population wide impact. In such cases, normative values of justice, human rights take priority along with scientific evidence. Stakeholders, myself and the scientific research team, people who are participants in clinical trial, people who will be benefited from the research, governments and regulatory bodies. Ethical issues arising during clinical trials, unless we put in the place we put in place systems that ensure safety of patients and good quality of trials, people will get away with undisclosed side effects or complications that arise from such trials. Human rights of people are violated in those nations where there is lax regulatory vigilance on clinical trials. Poverty and compulsions of people in poor nations who have to put themselves in peril in such situations are not prevented due to loopholes in regulation. Transparency of the trials conducted till now and the data must be published accurately. The tangible expression of patient autonomy in clinical research is the process of informed consent. Vulnerable population require close and careful attention during the clinical trial design, with notable recruitment considerations and high quality observation methods of overall safety and efficacy strategies ensuring research. In this case, it is the heart patients. Providing relevant, understandable information in potential study patients will likewise become more challenging. Similarly, the intricacy of adverse events potentially associated with newer therapeutic agents has increased substantially. In such cases, what will be the responsibility of the company doing the trials and the compensation to the patients in such cases? Regulatory bodies must be thorough in demanding full compliance of laws and data related to trials. As a head and part of research team, it would be ideal to conduct the trials in the country within the country itself rather than shifting to a third country with lax regulation. This is mainly because the success of trial will mean a new paradigm shift in heart treatment, and people of all nations will be benefited. Moreover, if the trial is successful, then nations with strict regulatory environment would demand clinical trials conforming to certain norms which may have not been possible in another nation. Instead, if it was done in USA, then other nations would willingly introduce the treatment without much resistance and with full confidence. Initial issues may be high, but finally it was come to fruition without discrepancy. Nations and people will have more confidence in the authenticity and efficacy of the treatment. Hence, if the team has been transparent and objective in the trial, one must have complete confidence in their research. There is no need to fear intense scrutiny. Conclusion: as clinical trials have increasingly become multinational, ethical considerations have been raised not only about the studies but about the treatment of patients after studies have been completed. Since the role of research is critical for healthcare systems advancement, there is a need for finding methods to provide incentives with minimizing conflict of interest and maximizing preferable outcomes. So this is it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope my initiative is helping you all, guys. And if you are new to my channel, please subscribe to my channel. Also press the like button if you have liked the video. Thank you so much for being part in this video. See you next time. That is, see you tomorrow.